No, with an Insta360 X4, you should not simply use the standard settings in low light. The result will often not be good. This is also due to the relatively small image sensors. But today I'm going to show you how you can still take good shots with the X4 in low light conditions. For example, indoors or in the evening. We're going to change a number of camera settings. At the end, we'll save them as a preset, so we can call up our low light settings whenever we need them. I'm going to use the 360 mode today, but most of what I'm going to say applies to the single lens mode as well. In 360 mode, you can choose between the standard video mode and the Active HDR mode for video recordings. The Active HDR mode is primarily intended for situations in which there are very bright and very dark areas in the image at the same time. This mode makes it possible to retain details in the very bright and very dark areas, and this could be particularly useful for indoor shots. Unfortunately, the Active HDR mode is not well suited for low light shots. In low light and thus also indoors, I therefore only use the standard video mode. The first settings for resolution and frame rate are particularly important. Basically, the higher the resolution, the better the image quality. However, there are consumer cameras such as the GoPro Hero 13 or the Ace Pro which achieve better image quality at a lower resolution in low light. Does this also apply to the X4? The highest possible resolution on the X4 is 8K. However, you must not forget that you still have to reframe the shot. As a result of the reframing, your shot will then only have a resolution of 2.7K. You should therefore generally only reduce the resolution on the X4 if this offers a clear advantage. And in fact, the sensors of the X4 work in such a way that in low light, similar to the Ace Pro, significantly better results are achieved with a lower resolution. This is probably because the light captured by several pixels can now be used for a single pixel. The optimum resolution in low light is therefore 5.7K and not 8K or even 5.7K plus. The camera itself draws your attention to this. Due to the additional loss of quality during the reframing process, you should also avoid 4K. 5.7K therefore clearly leads to the best results in low light. In 5.7K you can choose between several frame rates between 24 and 60 frames per second. Which is the best choice? A higher frame rate usually enables particularly smooth and natural looking shots. However, more frames per second have to be recorded. This means there is less time to expose the individual frame. The camera can therefore only capture less light for the single frame. For this reason, higher frame rates in low light are a disadvantage. I would therefore recommend a frame rate of 24. All those who live in the PAL region, on the other hand, should use 25 frames per second. The PAL region includes most countries outside the US and Canada. Now we need to talk about exposure settings. To achieve the best possible results in low light, we should set the exposure completely manually. To do this, swipe to the left and select Manual at the bottom right. You should know that the brightness of a shot, so the exposure, basically depends on three factors: the aperture, the shutter speed and the ISO. The aperture is the size of the opening inside your lens through which light passes. On the X4, the aperture cannot be changed, so this value is not important for us today. The shutter speed determines the duration of the exposure time. That is how long the light can fall on the sensor. We can control this value on the X4. In low light conditions, the shutter speed should be as slow as possible to capture as much light as possible. The last factor is the ISO value. This value determines how sensitively the camera reacts to light. The higher the ISO value, the brighter the image, because the camera reacts more sensitively to the incident light. Unfortunately, if the ISO value is too high, image noise and artifacts are generated. The image becomes brighter, but the image quality decreases. These exposure basics apply not only to the X4, but basically to any camera. However, you should always bear in mind that the X4 has two very small sensors, which certainly has its advantages, but is a clear disadvantage in low light. Let's now look at the settings in detail. The first setting here on the left concerns the color profile. You have the choice between standard, vivid and flat. You should definitely do without vivid in low light. Vivid has a lot of contrast. The dark areas in the image, and there can be a lot of these in low light, will be very dark. Details are lost. Flat has slightly less contrast and less saturation than the standard color profile. Flat is therefore particularly suitable if you want to edit the colors of your shots. When it comes to pure image quality, however, it offers no relevant advantages in poor lighting conditions. You also need to add saturation and contrast in post, otherwise the image will not look good. I therefore recommend standard as the color profile for anyone who is not very interested in color grading. The second setting from the left is very important, the shutter speed. As explained earlier, this determines the duration of the exposure and should therefore be as slow as possible. However, the shutter speed not only influences the brightness of the image, but also the motion blur. A longer exposure leads to more motion blur. Fast movements will blur more. There is a basic rule in filmmaking for the optimum amount of motion blur. The shutter speed should be exactly twice as high as the frame rate. At the frame rate of 25 or 24 frames per second, the shutter speed should be 1/50th of a second. In low light, I therefore set my shutter speed manually to 1/50th of a second. To get even more light, you could also set your shutter speed to the value of your frame rate. In other words, to 1/24 or 1/25. But you will get far too much motion blur. Your shot will look very strange, especially if there is a lot of movement. Such a low shutter speed is therefore only useful if your shot does not contain a lot of movement. For example, for a talking headshot or a very static situation like this one. You can then add movement afterwards as usual using keyframes and by changing the framing. You should also know that there is an important disadvantage if we set the shutter speed manually to 1/50th. Due to the resulting motion blur, which in theory would actually be optimal, the electronic stabilization of your X4 can no longer work as efficiently. An electronic stabilization needs very sharp images to work well. For this reason, despite the otherwise excellent flow state stabilization, unsightly jerks could occur. It would therefore be ideal if you use the X4 on a pole and move it as smoothly as possible. Ideally, you should attach it to a tripod. If you are still looking for mounts and tripods for the X4, you will find a link to Insta360's accessories in the video description. The ISO value is particularly important for shooting in low light. As already mentioned, a high ISO value leads to a brighter image, but also to more image noise. The goal should therefore be to set the ISO value as low as possible. As we have set the shutter speed manually, we can now use the ISO value to adjust the brightness of the image. In general, you should remember, up to an ISO value of 400, the image quality is good. When reframing, possible image noise is greatly reduced by the software. However, this also means that details are lost and the image quality decreases. From an ISO value of around 800, this becomes increasingly noticeable. Shots with an ISO of 1600 or higher are barely usable. In a perfect world, you should never use an ISO value of more than 200. Of course, this is not always possible in low light, so you should manually set a value of 400 or 800 depending on the situation. You can also set a maximum ISO value here on the left under Auto. The camera will then automatically adjust the exposure, but will never exceed this value. You should therefore use a maximum of 400 or 800 here. I usually leave the white balance on the X4 on Auto. The automatic setting normally works very well. However, a manual white balance would definitely have advantages. With very long shots, the automatic could change the white balance for no clear reason, which could ruin your shot. It's also possible that the artificial light could mislead the camera, resulting in strange skin tones. The correct value for the white balance in low light depends on the color temperature of your light source. We should also take a look at two important settings in the main menu for optimum results. Swipe your finger downwards and to the left and then tap on the icon for the settings menu. Under image settings, there are two more settings that are important for us today: the bitrate and the sharpness. For better results, you should make sure that the bitrate is set to high. This leads to larger files, but also to a better image quality. I usually set the sharpness to medium or low. High sharpness does not lead to more detail. Instead, the edges are artificially emphasized by the camera. That may look good at first glance, but it's not cinematic and doesn't look professional. But be careful, if you use low, the image can look very soft, and it may be necessary to add some sharpness in post. If you don't want to edit your shots, you should use medium. We have now set up our X4 optimally. Now tap on the quick menu button on the right hand side. Here we can save our settings so that we can quickly activate them again later. You can use the plus button to create a new preset. I tap on the plus button and use Customize as the name. Here you can see the most important settings of your preset and change them if necessary. Save the settings with Add Preset. Now I would like to give you a few simple but important tips for shooting in low light. When shooting indoors, make the best possible use of the available light. This means that if it's still bright outside, place your subject near the window and use the natural light as a light source. This usually leads to better results than the artificial light in the room. Also bear in mind that a low light shot can also look like a low light shot. You can therefore expose your shot a little darker. It's normal for a night shot to look dark overall. And of course, you can also bring some additional light sources with you. This RGB light here, for example, is not expensive and can easily be taken anywhere. You should also pay attention to the dynamic range, especially when taking indoor shots. If it's relatively dark in the room, but there is still daylight outside, your windows could burn out completely if they are in the frame. Such a shot will not look good. Avoid such a situation if possible, or adjust your exposure accordingly. Always if it makes sense. So let's recap the most important points. Use a low frame rate, for example 24 or 25 frames per second. Set the shutter speed manually to twice the frame rate, so to 1/50th of a second if you are filming at 24 or 25 frames per second. Adjust the exposure using the ISO value, whereby the image quality will drop sharply, especially above 800. And don't forget that the stabilization won't work as well in low light. And if there are still situations where you're not entirely happy with your X4 shots, then I highly recommend my tutorial on the 11 most common X4 beginner mistakes. You'll see, it contains a few essential tips and tricks. And that's it for today. If the video was helpful for you, give me a like as feedback. There will be more X4 tutorials to come. So stay tuned and see you next time.